Hello and welcome to the next video, the long-awaited video in the Kilpin Knitting Club series. Apologies, it's been a few weeks since my last video. Today I'm going to talk about how you knit using different colours. So far all the knitting that I've shown you has all been in the same colour, and sometimes you will want to have a pattern that's got a different combination of colours in it, whether you want to knit with so that you end up with like a picture on the front of your knitting, or whether it's a repeating pattern of different colours, or if you want to do something like stripes. These are all really interesting ways of making your knitting more exciting, but they are actually really simple because it's really just a case of dropping one of your colours and picking up another one and then knitting as normal. So actually it doesn't need to be any more complicated than knitting with one colour. There's several different ways that you can incorporate different colours into your knitting, as I mentioned. The simplest way is something like this. So this is the jumper that I'm happen to be wearing today, and I'm not taking it off to show you because it's a bit cold in here, but all I've done here is done stripes of different colours. So really all I've done is I've knitted a few rows, and then at the end of this row I've just dropped the pink one and I've picked up this gold one and I've just carried on knitting with that. And then I've just carried on knitting with that for a few rows, and then I've done the same with the black. So it's super simple, and because these stripes are quite wide, what I've done here is once I've dropped this pinky red one, I've left a couple of inches so I can tuck in the strand behind the knitting, and I've just cut it. So I don't even have to worry about that colour anymore. I would just put the ball to one side and pick it up again if I want to start knitting with this colour again. And then I pick up the gold and then do the same with that. Knit a few rows with that, get here, and then I would leave myself a few inches of the gold and then cut it so I can put the gold aside and then start knitting with the black. So really I'm not getting myself into a tangle with this because I'm only knitting with one colour at one time, and when I change over I'm just putting aside the other colour, cutting it away so it's completely away from the knitting so I can't get it tangled up, and then carrying on with the other one. If you're doing stripes that are narrower than this, so only a few rows at a time before you're switching back to the other colour, you can leave the original colour attached to your knitting so you don't have to keep cutting it and reattaching it, and I'll show you how to do that. Another way you can incorporate colours into your knitting is something like this. So this is a Fair Isle jumper I knitted myself last year. As you can see, rather than it being stripes of one colour per row, you've actually got a repeating pattern of several different colours within one row. So I'm not sure how easy this is to see, but for example here, I've got two stitches here of this creamy colour, and then I've got a purple, then I've got another couple of stitches of the creamy colour, and then two stitches of the purple, and so on. It repeats like this, and I followed a pattern to do this. The pattern was different for every row, so what I've ended up with is this beautiful repeating pattern like this. Now, Fair Isle knitting is not only very attractive and quite addictive, if you ask me, to watch the pattern being produced in your knitting, but it's also functional. Because on the other side of knitting like this, where you've got more than one colour in each row, you end up with an effect like this. So what I've had to do is, when I've switched colour, I've put the wool to the back, and then I've knitted with the other colour, but what happens is as I'm knitting with the other colour, this original colour is carrying on behind it like this, so you end up with these strands that go along the back of your knitting. So rather than it being a lot of purl stitches like you would see normally on the wrong side of normal knitting, you've got all these strands of the wrong colours, if you like, the colours that aren't being used, being carried across the back. And this is functional because it's a really good way of making your garments warmer than they would normally be, because this layer of knitting here is thicker than it would normally be, because not only have you got the normal stitches under there, but then you've got these lengths of wool across the back creating up this extra layer. So this is one way that historically knitting has been used to make garments even warmer, because you've got built up layers of wool on the back of the garment, making it really nice and warm and cosy. Another way that you can do this through knitting is by cabling. So cabling is what you might traditionally see in an Aran jumper, and this is where the knitting sort of crisscrosses over itself. And this achieves the same sort of thing. It thickens up the knitting by having several layers of wool going on at the back to create an even warmer garment. So the way you would do this is, as I said, you would be knitting along the row following a pattern. So the pattern would tell you when to change colour. I'll have a look at the pattern for this one and I'll show you how that works. And then you would knit for however many stitches in one colour it tells you to, and then you would set aside that ball of wool and then pick up the other one to do the next stitch, and then you put that one down, pick up the other one, and then knit however many stitches that one's told you to do, and keep repeating and repeating that as you go along the row. It sounds complicated, but once you've got the hang of it, it's actually really straightforward. The key to it is to not get yourself into a tangle. And the knack to that is to make sure that you've always got one colour on top and one colour on the bottom. That makes more sense when I'm actually showing you how to do it, and I will show you. Lastly, you can cheat. So here I've got a project that I'm working on at the moment. This is a scarf for my mum, and as you can see, it changes colour as we go along the scarf in sort of these banded stripes of purple, different shades of purple. But this is all the same wool. This is what we call variegated wool, or variegated yarn, and it changes colour as you go along the length of it. So this is all one piece of wool, as you'd expect for a ball of yarn, but as you go along it changes colour. So some of it's this sort of pinky purple, and then it goes to this solid bluey purple, and then you've got some purple here that's got a bit of white in it, so you get more of a lilac colour. So that's how I've achieved this beautiful colour changing effect, almost like an ombre as you go along the knitting here. So this is a really good way of incorporating different colours into your knitting without actually having to bother changing colour, because the wool does it for you. Variegated wool can be a bit more expensive, but it's a really great way of getting some really interesting colour effects into your knitting without any extra effort. So firstly, how do you change colours in a stripe? By that I mean one colour per row, or several rows in the same colour and then changing to another colour for several rows. So here's a piece I made earlier. This is all one colour of pink, and I've decided I'm going to do the next row in a different colour. So my different colour is this slightly different coloured pink, and all I'm going to do with this is I'm always going to change colour at the end of a row. So I've finished my row here, so I'm going to start here. What I'm going to do is just grab the end of this yarn. Get yourself a nice long tail, because we're going to tuck this into the back of your knitting in the end, but you don't want it too short in case it will pull through by accident. So give yourself a good couple of inches, and then put your needle. I'm going to knit here. This is my knit side of the work. I'm going to put my needle into the first stitch as if I'm going to knit, and then rather than picking up my working yarn, which was this one down here, I'm going to use this one, which is my new colour. What I've done here is I've created a loop, and I've just trapped it in between my fingers like this, and I'm going to pop that over my working needle, the right hand needle here, and then we're going to pull that through like so, as if we're knitting, because we are, and then pop the stitch off as normal. So we've knitted, but we've knitted with a different colour than what we started with. It will come up a bit loose because you've got two different ends of yarn here, but don't worry about that. Just be careful that you don't drop anything. This is why you need your tail to be quite long, so you don't pull it through by accident. And then you can carry on the next stitch. Make sure you pick up the right colour, which is the new colour that we're working with here, which is the darker pink, and then knit with that as normal. So it will come through a little bit loose, but as you do your stitches, it will get anchored in place and it will start to feel a bit more normal. So I've jumped ahead a little bit. So what I've done is I've knitted all the way along my knitting with my new colour, and then I've started to come along the back and purl. So the end result will be I end up with 2 rows in my new colour. And I just wanted to show you how I've got back here at the start. So this is where I've knitted along this way, I've purled back along this way, and I've ended up at the end here where I'd changed my colour. So this is no different really from any other knitting or purling, but you do just need to be careful because this is where you've got some loose ends of wool, because this is where you changed colour. So if you remember when we started our first row with this new colour, it was all a little bit loose because it wasn't really attached to anything. And the same applies here, because these 2 stitches that I'm about to purl into were the first stitches that I made with the new colour, and therefore they're a little bit loose. I'm not going to do them any differently. I'm just going to be very careful that I don't pull anything through by accident. So just be very careful. You can be quite loose, because you can, once you've finished your knitting, you can then manually just pull on these stitches yourself. This is why it's important that the tails are nice and long, so you've got lots of length to work with. And there we have it. So I'll just turn it around to the right side. I'm not sure how easily you can see that because I've only done a couple of rows, but you can see now I've got a couple of rows of this darker pink here. And if I wanted to make this a very narrow stripe and I wanted to go back to my pale pink, what you didn't see me do was cut this pale pink off because I decided I was going to come back and use it pretty quickly. So I've just left it loose here. It's quite straightforward really if you are doing stripes of one colour like I've just done, because there's not really much risk you're going to get in a tangle with this. All I've done is put this ball of pink to one side. I put it behind me, I put it here, so I've just kept it sort of out of the way of all the stitches that I've been doing in the dark pink. But now I'm going to pick it up again. This is a bit simpler now because both of these colours are now attached to the knitting pretty securely. So I don't have to worry quite so much about leaving a tail or things being loose because everything's already attached. So I'm just going to pick up my pink, my pale pink, and then knit as normal. And that's it really. I'm away. And then I can do as many rows in this one as I want to. And I could come back to this dark pink if I wanted to. I haven't cut that off either. So that's still sitting at the back of my knitting. And I could come back to it and do stripes in the dark pink if I wanted to. It's important to note that if you're going to do what I've just shown you, and rather than cutting off your different colours when you finish with them, just leave them to one side so you can pick them up easily once you decide to go back to that colour. It's important to note that you can only do that over an even number of rows, because if you were to knit from one end of your work to the other and leave the other colour behind, as it were, attached to that first end of your row, if you get to the other end, you're at the wrong end. So you'd have to have knitted back again, or purled back again, if that's what the pattern tells you to do, to pick up that colour. Otherwise you'll end up with it crisscrossing all over the back of your knitting. So you can see here I've done another knit of this original light pink colour across the top here. But what I couldn't do now is go, oh well, I want to do another row of the dark pink now, because the dark pink is attached at this end. It's here. So I couldn't pick it up from here, which is where I'm about to knit from. I would have to do another row across here to be able to pick it up. That's not to say it's impossible to do it that way, but what you'd have to do is I'd have to cut this here, I'd have to cut the dark pink here and then pick it up again at the other end. It's just not impossible. If the pattern tells you that's what you got to do, then that's what you got to do, but it just means you can't carry your yarn around the back. You have to cut it and start again, which can make the back a little bit messy looking, but it's okay if that's what the pattern asks you to do. So there we are. I've done another couple of rows in this light pink, and you can kind of see now that these were the 2 rows I did in the dark pink, and then I switched back to the light pink here, and it looks quite attractive if you ask me. So what we did here is we didn't cut the dark pink, we've just left it loose, and we did the same with the light pink when we were going to do the dark pink rows. We just left them loose at the back, and the end result is that, I'm not even sure how well you can see because it's actually quite neat, is you will, in these rows where I've been doing the dark pink, I've got a strand of the light pink here that was just being carried up the side, very discreetly, just being carried up on the back. So you can't see it at the front, so it's not a problem at all. You've just got this strand of pink here. So the more rows I did in this dark pink, the longer that strand of the light pink would be. And if you do quite a few rows in that new colour, in that stripe, if that's quite a wide stripe, then you might want to think about, well, maybe rather than carrying that pink up there, maybe I should cut it and then re-add it as a new piece of yarn to keep it nice and neat. Because the longer you get, the longer this random piece of light pink would be on the back, and what you don't want, especially if it's a piece of clothing, is a big loose loop at the back of this yarn that things can get caught in, like your fingers. So you may just want to cut it anyway and then start fresh if it's going to be a nice long stripe. But here, because it's only a few rows, I've just carried it up the back and you can barely see it, and nothing's going to get caught in that because it's not that much bigger than a stitch all by itself. So that is how you do stripes of different colours in your knitting. Now, as you can see, I've done a few more rows of this light pink here, so you can see my dark pink stripe here, nice and clear in my knitting, and it looks quite attractive. Now, if you want to do fair isle knitting, which is where you change colours as you go through the row, this is a bit more complicated. You've got to keep your wits about you, but if you practice, actually I think you'll find it's probably a bit simpler than it might first appear. You always follow a pattern doing a fair isle pattern because it will tell you how many stitches of each colour to do, and quite often this will be in a repeating pattern. So I don't know, let's say you've got a repeating pattern of 18 stitches, your whole work might be a lot bigger than that, but you've got a repeating pattern of 18 stitches, and it might tell you to do the first 4 in one colour, and then do 1 in another colour, and the next 3 in another colour. Quite often it's just 2 colours, so you'll just be switching between one and the other, but sometimes you have even more complex patterns with 3 colours. I've never personally done one with 4, but I'm sure they exist. If you want to knit something like a Fair Isle pattern, then your knitting pattern will contain something that looks a bit like this. Now, I realise this pattern probably looks a little bit terrifying, but this is the pattern I used to make that jumper that I showed you earlier, and it was the first Fair Isle pattern I'd ever attempted, and actually I got into the swing of it really quickly. So the way you read a knitting pattern like this is it's exactly the opposite of the direction you'd go in if you were reading a piece of writing. So rather than going from left to right and top to bottom, like you would if you were reading a book, you will go from right to left and bottom to top. So you would start this particular pattern down here at the bottom right corner. Then in here, you've got a series of repeating patterns. So this particular pattern goes all the way around the neck of the jumper. You can see it in the illustration here, that it goes all the way around. What is quite common in Fair Isle patterns is it will decrease or increase as it goes along. So you're creating a cone shape to go around what we call the yoke, or that shape around the shoulders. I'll come to that a bit later. Now in this pattern, because it's for a jumper, it comes with instructions of how to do lots of different sizes. So you would see further up in the pattern, it would give you some guidance of how many inches around the chest a small, medium and large would be, and so on. So you would pick one and then you would follow the pattern according to those measurements. So you'll cast on a different number of stitches for each size, and you will also start and repeat this pattern at different points depending on which size you've chosen. So as long as you know which size you're after, you just need to have a look at here that. You've got instructions of where you need to skip some rows. So for example, rows 2 and 3 here say skip round in all women's sizes. So if you were doing one of the women's sizes, you would just skip them. You just wouldn't do them. Further up, there's one here that says skip round for sizes small and medium. So you would do that. Every so often on here, it does helpfully tell you how many stitches you're supposed to have in your round. There's more than one number of stitches because each of these corresponds to a different size. So if you're doing small, and it will tell you this further up the pattern, then it would be the first one. So down here, you would be doing 240 stitches. Medium is 256 and so on. So you just need to look out for the size that you're doing. A good idea might be, if you're just starting to do this pattern, is to decide what size you want and then print off this pattern if you can, and then go through with a highlighter pen and highlight which bits you need to do for your particular size. And then you are only going to focus in on the bits that you need to worry about. So if you were going to knit in this pattern, this is not the very beginning, so you've already knitted from the bottom up of this jumper. So you will be, if you can see where my mouse is, you'll be around here on the pattern. So you'll already have all your stitches on your knitting by then, so you're not going to worry about casting on or anything because you already have done that. But to follow this pattern, you've got a key at the side here, which tells you what colours to do. Now, the beauty of a knitting pattern is you can do whatever colour you take that takes your fancy. So this one is, if you ask me, a rather drab combination of different brown colours, but you might be doing it in some pinks and some blues, perhaps some whites. So all you've got to do is remember which colour corresponds to which colour on this pattern. So if you've decided the main colour of this jumper is going to be black, then that corresponds to this sort of brown colour in the pattern. So you just need to remember every time you saw that brown colour, you're actually knitting in black. So you'd start at the bottom right of this pattern, and the first few rows are actually really simple. There is no colour change in here. This is all just going to be this one colour, whatever colour that happens to be for you. At the bottom here, this is quite a complicated pattern, so you've got different places to start depending on what size you are. So this is where that highlighter pen would come in very useful, because you could look in here and see where you're going to start. And that is true for this whole pattern all the way up. Let's say you're doing a large man's size, that's this one here. You would start each round of this pattern at that point. That's just to make sure you've got the right number of repeating patterns in your round that you're doing. And then over here, this bit says repeat. So once you've started here, let's say for your large man's size, you would knit up to that point, and then you would just keep repeating this bit that's highlighted in the black bracket. So you wouldn't have to worry about this begin large man's point. You would just start there, and then you got to the repeated section, do the repeated section and then go back to the start of the repeated section and just keep doing that in a big circle until you got to the end of the round. Once you've done that, you've completed round 1. And then once you got to round 2, then you would again come back to this point here where it says begin large mounds, if that's the size you're doing, go up to the point where it starts the repeating pattern, and then keep repeating this section here that's in the bracket until you get to the end of the round, and so on. So the first few rows are all just the same colour, so that's pretty straightforward. Then you'd get up here to round 9. This is where it's useful to keep track of what round you're on as well, whether you're writing down as a tally or maybe you've got an app on your phone to record what round you're on, so you can keep track of where you are. This has got 2 different colours within it. So you might be doing this one in white, or this white might be representing another colour that you're using. Just remember which colours it is you're wanting to use in your pattern. So let's say you are doing it in brown and white for the sake of this pattern. So you would start with a white stitch. So at this point you've not used white yet, so you'd be casting on, well, not casting on, you'd be looping some white onto your needle for that first knit stitch, as I showed you earlier in the video. And then you would then pick up the brown and knit 3 brown stitches. So remember, we're working from right to left, so we've started over here and we've done 1 white stitch, and then you would do 3 brown stitches, and then you would pick up the white again and do 1 stitch of white, pick up the brown again, do 3 stitches of brown, and so on. And this pattern repeats all the way around, regardless of where it is you started from. This pattern's pretty much the same all the way around. It's 3 brown, 1 white, 3 brown, 1 white. You would just keep doing that all the way around. As I mentioned, while you're doing this, you need to watch out to make sure that your wool is not getting into a tangle, because you'll be knitting with 2 different strands and 2 different balls of wool. So keep them next to you on the sofa. This is the trick I tend to use. Put one ball always in front of the other. So I tend to have one on the sofa next to me, and then the other one on the floor, or I'll have them both on the sofa, but one will always be towards my back and the other one towards my knee. And I keep them that way round, and one of them, I remember, always goes on top and the other one always goes underneath. And that way they're not wrapping around each other, going clockwise around each other, they're going back and forth, so they don't actually get tangled up. This might make a bit more sense when you're actually having a go for yourself. If you do start to get into a tangle, if you find that your technique is not working for you and the wool is getting wrapped around itself, it doesn't matter. You just got to, every so often, after you've changed colour a handful of times, in this pattern, this might be every 25 stitches or something, just have a look at your wool, put your needles down and just unwrap any tangles that you might have got into, because it's so much easier to untangle yourself if you've only wrapped it around a couple of times versus 100 times, trust me. So you'd keep doing that repeating pattern of 1 white and 3 brown until you got back to the beginning of the round. And then you'd move on to round 10. And this is a progression of this pattern. So now you'd be doing 2 white and 2 brown, 1 white, 2 brown, 3 white, 2, and so on. It just goes on. It helps if you can keep track of what you did on the previous round, because as you can see, this pattern on row 10 is building up on top of what you've already done in row 9. So you're supposed to be building up this sort of zigzag pattern. So if you're knitting along row 10, you'll know every time you come across one of these white ones from row 9 that you've already done, then you need to be doing either a 1 or a 3 of the whites on top of that. So you need to keep an eye and make sure that that's actually what's happening. So if you're doing a 3 white, if you've got to that point in your pattern, there should be a single white one underneath in the middle of where you're doing that. If it's not lining up properly, then you're doing it wrong, and it's much better to spot that early rather than get to the end of the round and realise you've done it wrong. I will do a later video on how you can unpick stitches that you've done wrong. It's actually not that difficult, especially if it's only a few stitches. So you keep working up. Remember, you'll be starting at whatever point the pattern tells you to start at, depending on the size. If it doesn't specify this, if you've got a simpler pattern than this, then you'll always just be starting here at the right-hand side. And then at some point, you'll see that it starts picking up this black. So you would loop that onto your needle as a new piece of wool, and then start incorporating that into your knitting as well. I think from memory, doing this pattern, there's no point where you have all 3 going at the same time, but I have done other patterns in the past where you have got all 3 in the same round, but it's the same principle. Now, because this is a decreasing pattern, so it's going from this point here just above the armpits and it's going further and further up towards the neck, it has got some decreases in it. The pattern describes down here in the key what decreases you should be doing, and these are ones you've done before: knit two together and slip slip knit. We've done those in previous videos. So when you got to that point in the pattern, you can see you've got some blue here. Now that's not a different colour, that's where you're missing out a stitch because you're going to do a decrease. So let's say we're going to do round 20 here. We've done 3 white, and then here we've hit a blue, so that means you're not going to do that particular stitch, but here next to it is the symbol that means knit two together. So these two squares, the blue one and the one that's got the symbol in it, you'll just do a knit two together as instructed, and that then becomes one stitch. So that's where that missing stitch comes from, because you're combining these two stitches into one here. And then for all the subsequent rows after that, that stitch is missing because you've decreased it and it's disappeared. And the same principle applies around the round. So here you've got one that's slip, slip, knit. This is to help it look nice and symmetrical. You've got a mixture of the two. And again, that's where you've got a missing stitch here, indicated by the blue. As you keep following the pattern along, that keeps happening. You've got more and more blue appearing in each 10 rounds or so. You've got some decreases, so that is built up more and more blues, and eventually you'll get to the top here where there's actually very few stitches in the repeating pattern because a lot of them have disappeared because you've just decreased them over and over again. Yeah, most of these repeating Fair Isle patterns you will find are done in the round, because they're either around a collar, like around the yoke like this, or you can also see in this pattern there's a repeating pattern at the hips and the sleeves. So you'll always be doing them in knit, because if you're knitting in the round, if you remember, we're never going to do any purl stitches unless the pattern tells you to. You're just going to be going round and round and round, doing knit, 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 unless the pattern tells you otherwise. So this will always be done in knit, and you will always be following it from right to left. If you happen to be doing this pattern on a flat piece of knitting, or knitting on straight needles, then there's a slightly different principle will apply. So if you were going to follow a pattern like that, you'll be knitting one way but purling the other, and rather than going from right to left and then the next round up and then right to left and the next one up, right to left, you'll be going side to side as you go round. So you would start going right to left. Let's say we've started at the bottom. You go right to left across this round at the bottom, and then you would go the next round up, and then you would go from left to right. So you'd follow it along that way, because that's the way you're knitting, is back and forth, rather than round and round. But of course, you'd be going knitting in one direction and purling in the other direction. You can purl in different colours the same way that you can with knitting. You'll just have all of your different colours of wool in front of the knitting, so it'll be between you and the knitting rather than behind the knitting. The same principle applies. So the way you would do that is simply by knitting in each of the colours that it tells you to in sequence. So let's say the first 4 stitches of this pattern have to be done in one colour, so I'm going to keep doing that in the light pink. 3, 4, and then it tells me I've got to do 2 stitches in the dark pink, or my other colour. So I'm going to put my needle into the next stitch to do that, and I've got to locate where I put the working yarn for the other pink. There we are. So then I'm going to pick that dark pink one up instead and knit with that. Do my 2 in the dark pink, and then I'm going to go back. The pattern tells me I've got to go back to the other one. Oh man, I've got so many threads going on here. Yeah, where are we? Here we are. This one, yes. And I'm going to knit with that one. Let's say it wants me to do 4 of those. It's a very simple repeating pattern. 4 stitches of my light pink and 2 stitches of my dark pink. So there we are. You can kind of see what I've done there. I've got 4 stitches of my light pink, 2 of the dark, 4 of the light pink, and I'm going to do 2 more of the dark pink. As you can see, I'm getting in a little bit of a mess at the back. I've got so many different threads. It's because I've kept changing colour. There we are, 2 more of the dark pink, and I would keep going along the row like that. Most patterns will be written in such a way that you have an even not an even number, a whole number of repeating patterns in your whole row. So if you've got a repeating pattern of 18 stitches, then your whole row would be, this is going to be fast math, let's say 72 stitches. That's 4 times 18, isn't it? I think so. Anyway, yes, fast maths. So most patterns will be a whole number of a repeating pattern. Sometimes it's not, depending on the size. Most of the time it will be. So you'll get to the end of your row and you'll have got to the end of a repeating pattern. So you would go along like that. Where was I? Was it the light pink? Oh my god, I've got so many strands at the back now. I need to do 4 of these. You watch, it won't be a round number of repeating patterns for this one because I've just made it up as I've gone along. Whoops, don't know what I've done with that one. So you may be wondering, you've seen me getting in a tangle already, how you stop yourself from getting into said tangle. Well, I've found the best way to make sure you don't get into a tangle doing this is, first of all, don't do it in front of a camera because I'm having to hold my knitting in midair like this rather than on my knee. Oh, it kind of is a round number of repeating patterns because I've got 4 left of this pale pink here and then we're on our way. That's not too bad really, is it? I made it up on the spot. Cool, so I've got to the end, there we are. And now you can see I've got a repeating pattern of 4 light pink, 2 dark, 4 light pink, 2 dark, and so on. And if the pattern asked me to, I would then purl along the other side and either do the same pattern, so 4 of the light pink, 2 of the dark, 4 of the light pink, so on, or it could be a different pattern. You know, if it's going to change as it goes up and we're going to create a pretty pattern of, I don't know, circles or things, then it would change. So the pattern will tell you how to do that. So yeah, the best way of not getting into a tangle, I've found, is by being quite disciplined about where you put your wool. And by that I mean where you put your balls of wool, like these. The way I tend to do it is I will always have 1 ball next to me on the sofa and 1 ball on the floor. Or let's say I will have both of them on the sofa next to me, but one of them will be nearer the back of the sofa and the other one will be nearer my knee. And then what I'll do is every time I change colour, I will make sure one of them is always at the bottom and one of them is always at the top. That way they won't get tangled up because you're just going up, down, up, down, up, down. They're not actually, what you don't want to do is get them wrapped around each other, but if you do it that way, they won't. They will just sort of go up and down like that. If you do get them wrapped around themselves, don't worry. If it's quite a small piece of knitting like this, where you're only really changing colour a handful of times, you won't really get into a tangle anyway. All you'll end up with is your wool getting wrapped around it itself a few times. But that's easy enough to remedy. You'll just get hold of the 2 balls of wool. Where's the other one gone? There. And then you would see where they'd got tangled up, and then you would untangle them just sort of doing this. Just wrap them the other way around themselves to get them untangled. If you're doing a bigger piece of knitting, then it's worth checking every 5 or 6 stitches or so to make sure you're not getting yourself into a tangle. And then if you are getting yourself into a tangle, you can either change the way that you're doing it, or you can just put your knitting down and get hold of those balls of wool and manually untangle them yourself. It's better to do that every few stitches, so you've only got a couple of wraparounds to unwrap, rather than waiting till you've got to the end and having sort of 17 of them to unravel.